Welcome back to Pastoral Conversations. We're continuing our a cuppa and a chat on racism, and I am joined by my friends again here today to continue our conversation on racism. I was really challenged by our conversation last week, as many of you brought up points for me to begin to listen and to think about and to search my own heart. So thank you guys for returning.
Yeah, my name's Carl Irvine. I'm the minister of St Andrew's Parish Church in Inverurie. I'm clearly white.
Thank you, Heather. So my name is Neil Meyer. I'm the minister at Kintore Parish Church, also here in Aberdeenshire, and I'm South African.
Hi guys, my name is Boitumelo. I'm a minister at Trinity Congregation Presbyterian in Grahamstown, South Africa. I'm very black. And I'm African, and yeah, I think that's capacity, doesn't it? Yeah, that's it.
I'm Rhona Cathcart. I'm the minister at Inverurie West Parish Church, where I've been for about 3.5 years. I am a dual national. I'm Canadian and Scottish, born and brought up in Canada, of a Scottish family, but have now lived in Scotland longer than in Canada.
Hello, my name is Aquila, and I am the minister at Fernhill and Cathkin Church in Glasgow. I was born in Pakistan. I came to this country when I was 2. I always tell people I was born in Pakistan, but I was made in Scotland. I'm well and truly Scottish.
My name is Joshua Mikelson. I'm a minister in Kemnay Church in Aberdeenshire as well. Also come from the United States.
And so as we continue this conversation, I would love for us to also unfold our faith into this, of what does God call us as Christians to do. Our viewers have submitted some questions, and they would like our take on some of these. The first one being, many people are protesting in a non-violent fashion, but some of the protests have resulted in some measure of violence. What should the Christian response be? So we're going to switch to protests. With this, we often even use conversations like peaceful protests, and I know there's some debate if one can even have a peaceful protest. And another viewer related to that said, when might it be justified to break the law? For example, a demonstration for Black Lives Matter that breaches the rules of social distancing. So I'm going to throw out protests to you, and where is the place for them? Is there a place for them? And this tension between protests and peaceful protests. Would anyone like to get that conversation going on? And you can speak into any context. They're going all around the world right now. And it is a tense time as COVID-19 is flaring too. So would anyone want to get the conversation going with protests? Carl, get us going with protests.
Yes, protests. I think when as Christians we see injustice, we have a duty to protest against it. Now, unfortunately, the reality is a protest with a lot of people is an unpredictable thing. But I think you also need to balance the sporadic outbursts of violence that happens at these protests, which I condemn, but you have to balance that with the ongoing, never-ending violence that are done to many people through racist structures and through everyday racism and through lives that are, right from the word go, destined to fail because of the society people have been born into and the colour of their skin. Now that's a far greater violence. And I think if you look at Jesus, when he saw such blatant wrong, he reacted against it too. Think of the driving out from the temple. There was a great wrong going on there, and he acted in what was, you could say, was a violent way. He overturned the tables, he drove out the money changers. I presume if there'd been a statue of a money changer, he might well have pulled the statue down. You know, it's a case of balancing arises spontaneously at a protest, which is protesting against a very real injustice. We can't balance that against all the horrendous, violent injustices done by, and it has to be said, white people on non-white people.
Thank you for starting that off with protests. Any other thoughts? Boitumelo, do you want to speak about protests?
I think as Christians, firstly, we need to look at the reason why there is a protest to start with. And I think where we can start is we ask ourselves two questions. One, do you have the right to complain? And if you do have the right to complain, if you complain, will you be heard? Now, will you be heard doesn't mean will the answer come out favorably. But we need to understand that for one to protest to start with, it's coming from a point of deep frustration that has built up for years. It's frustration, it's anger, and it is because people have run out of options. How do I do this? And when you call people together, it doesn't matter for what. Whenever there's a lot of people together, somebody will want to to play at it, you know. Wherever the sons of God are called together, check this. The devil is right there, bringing his own report. But the thing is, frustration leads to people having to protest. It is difficult when protesting is your only option. And even as you take to it, you don't know if it will be safe. Many people talk about protest turning into violence, and we leave out the part of peaceful protest, which is usually how they start out, being met by violence. And coming from a South African point of view, where I have seen many, and unfortunately being part of many protests, where we will, have you ever seen nice people protesting, singing? That's good. And the music is supposed to motivate you. And you protest only to be attacked by police with dogs, police with bullets. So there is no way where the violent will not be there. It is not a part of the plan. That being said, you also have to ask, and the violence is usually referred to with regard to looting. We are not going to excuse the criminal element. That is a reality. But you need to ask yourself, if somebody feels that this is the only way they can have access, and sometimes it is done deliberately, and I'm talking from an experience point of view, it is done deliberately because when that happens, guess what? We sit up and pay attention. While we could have easily ignored, when people get frustrated, they find means of forcing you to look, forcing us to pay attention. And this is why there is an anger, because in my opinion, if you are the one that is in a system that is favoring you, I don't see where you get the right to determine how I protest, where you do not know what is making me protest, when you do not know how I cannot be safe, even in my own house. Outside is another story, but even in my own house, I cannot understand why when I am working with people, I will be singled out simply because of how I look, and look at the people not really asking for help, but not understanding how this can go past their heads. Now, as for church, we often say that church cannot look away, and I'm very happy, Heather, you said that we cannot be quiet. But another thing we are looking at, or we are missing as church, I think most of the time, is the fact that we are looking outside through the window and we forget to look at the racism inside and instilled by church. Because church has been a perpetrator of many atrocities, and to a large extent, it supports, well, not say is, it, we support that, because as long as you're a church, whether you are personally involved or not, what we do, we are all, it's a communal sin that we are part of, and we cannot exclude ourselves. So you need to ask, or we need to ask, if these people feel they have to riot, if they came to me, would I listen? And assuming that I am empowered to do something about it, would I even take the risk? Because it is risky to act. Would I take the risk of acting at this particular time?
Yeah.
I think that's enough damage for one session. Thanks.
I love the questions that she left us with, and I'm going to repeat those for all of us. For us to search our hearts for our own communal sin, which the church is built on. And it's throughout history, it's all throughout scriptures. It's there, the generational sin. And we continue with that today. And so it does start here, and we look inward. At the same time, we start the conversation, which we're doing today. And do we take the time to listen? There's a challenge for us as we go forward. And where is God calling us to take a risk, to take a leap of faith in who we're listening to, and perhaps to step out of our comfort zone or bubble? So we are going to continue the conversation on racism, but we're going to start with the topic of colonialism. Many of our public statues, we followed this here in the UK, for example, was it Edward Colston in Bristol? And even in the United States, there's marked holidays such as Columbus Day. They remind us that we have a really complex history with colonialism and racism. As Christians, I have a viewer submitted this, how can we deal with and learn from our shared history in meaningful and constructive ways? So Carl, would you begin our conversation on colonialism and in the news with the statues, and how do we begin to enter into this and think about this as Christians with racism that exists in this world?
I can't remember who it was that said it, but there's someone much cleverer than me said, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I think the problem with just saying, okay, let's get rid of all these statues because they're racist or of racists, runs the risk of getting rid of our knowledge of that history. I think what would be far better is that we recognize the context they were in. And I think the other problem with statues is that statues is just one small part. I mean, I know Glasgow University recently recognized that they were originally founded on money that came really from the blood, sweat, and bones of slaves in West Indies. And I think as their way of acknowledging this, they were setting up some sort of deal or co-working, joint working. I think it was with Jamaica. If we look at our society, almost every single benefit that we enjoy, and I'm speaking here as a Scottish/UK society, is because of the British Empire. And our museums are stuffed full of things looted from around the world. Our financial systems are built on the backs of oppression. And where would you stop? So I don't think simply tearing down a statue or 100 statues is going to address the core issue. And the core issue is facing up to our past. And not only facing up to it, but facing up to it in some sort of positive way. I don't know the full details of the Glasgow University West Indies one, but certainly even today, we are extracting from so many countries we oppressed interest payments on debts that they cannot afford to repay. I mean, one simple thing we could do would be to simply wipe out third world debt, say, you see that debt? I tear it up. It's no longer with us. And that would be a huge step, because racism is essentially rooted in inequality. And as long as the inequality persists, then the racism is going to feed and engorge itself.
Yeah, Carl, you're bringing up a great issue that people can address in this too, is inequality, and how do we address that? You talked about getting rid of loans. I'm sure education will come up with this. So how do we address our past of colonialism? And with that, we're really seeing that brought into the news with statues and how to deal with that. And should we have heroes that are put up in our town squares who supported racism. I think that's different than acknowledging our past too. Would anyone else like to enter into this conversation? Rhona, we'll go to you first.
I was just going to say, continuing on the idea of context and education. I mean, I know there have been some suggestions, for example, that maybe certain statues could be relocated, or they could be paralleled with statues which represent a different point of view on the same sort of historical situation, if there's a particular thing that's being addressed. And part of what's involved there, I think, is you hear people arguing that knocking down statues is changing history. And historians will tell you it's not changing history, and that history is always changing and evolving as our perspective changes. And one of the things, even sort of a minor trivial example, but I remember being surprised slightly the first time I was watching the Olympics from Scotland as opposed to Canada. And suddenly, all the Canadian skaters I expected to see featured largely on the production, and were not there. And there was all this focus on all these British skaters, and I'm like, why are they focusing on these wonderful Canadian skaters? And it was an example of how point of view changes your perspective. The Olympic Games were still the same, but where you chose to focus your eye had been directed. And I think part of dealing with this issue is opening our perspective, reading a lot, discovering what historical events looked like from a different perspective. I mean, kind of all of us have some colonial connection one way or the other. I grew up as a colonial, if you like. And we need to be open and listening to what it looked like from somebody else's point of view.
Yeah. I love that illustration from the Olympics. I've experienced that watching the Olympics in about 3 or 4 different countries, and it's just that different perspective. And I can confess as an American that when you watch the Olympics in America, all you see are Americans. They basically wipe out anyone else unless they get a gold medal in that way. And so I think we'll go to Neil. We really need to do consider who's in our town squares and the perspective and story that we're telling. Neil, continue the conversation.
I have to say the situation in South Africa was very different. I mean, after 94, we had a lot of this. It wasn't just statues that came down, although that was part of it, but road names changed, town names changed, etc. And it was, I think the situation was different there, in that, you know, you had people walking down roads named after people who they experienced as oppressors. Looking up at statues of people who had, committed the most horrid atrocities against them and their people. And so it was a painful thing for them to walk past those statues. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't happen. You know, I mean, for somebody who's come from India and to see, statues of people who were involved in the partition and so forth, horrendous. Just, same thing as slavery, etc. So I'm not saying that doesn't exist. I'm just saying it was an issue that had to be dealt with in the changeover that happened there. As I look at the situation in the UK, the thing that worries me, and this comes back to what Carl was saying, is it worries me that tearing down statues is just too darn cheap. I tear down a statue, I feel very good about myself. Oh, we've dealt with racism. You haven't even scratched the surface. And Carl's right. There are issues of third world debts, which entrench the ongoing racism in the world, and other matters as well. And I do think that the deeper issue is our awareness of our colonial past and how that has been seen by others. I really think there's a huge gap in education in terms of people understanding what the British Empire, which we celebrate here, but what that actually, the legacy that has left behind in other parts of the world. And here I do think there is a difference between guilt and responsibility. And I think a good example of seeing the difference between just feeling guilty about it and, woe is me, sackcloth and ashes, which also doesn't achieve anything, as opposed to taking responsibility, like what Carl is suggesting in terms of cancelling third world debt. I think a really good example is the way that the Second World War is taught in Germany. So German children grow up aware of their of the history of Nazism. That's not to say that they take personal responsibility for Hitler or for the Holocaust, but that they take that they take guilt for that, but that they take responsibility for what they culturally have received as a legacy from the past. And I don't see a similar self-awareness amongst white UK residents as you would perhaps amongst German children.
That's a good comparison. And how do we take responsibility for our past? Not to have a guilt focus of that. We can't own those particular sins, but we can take responsibility and move forward into the future. And you guys are bringing up the point of education, and specifically in our schools, and learning about a situation from different perspectives. And so specifically with the British Empire, not just seeing it in the heyday of it, but what were the other atrocities that happened as a result. And I think that's a change that we can speak out. We talked about in our last episode, where can we speak out? And that is one thing, that and Carl, you're saying that we could speak out in terms of education. Anyone want to continue that part of the conversation today about colonialism and the statues and how we're going forward of owning our past? And do you just want to whitewash it? Do we want to just tear it down? Or do we want to seek forward a different way to educate and towards the future? So I'm going to give it to you again. Boitumelo, would you continue the conversation? Oh.
She's in the southern hemisphere, so she should be upside down, actually.
Dear. That was terrible, Neil. I love it.
With regard to the statues and stuff, I will be honest in that I don't really know how I feel and to what extent that can actually make a difference. But just to give an example, I went to India a little bit back, and you are taken to historical sites. There are a lot of monuments and stuff. And my major question kept on being, where are the Indians in this? Because it was all about the Brits. It was all, you have a monument for Victoria, you had this, nothing about the people of the land. And when I look at it, I see the way that the story is evolving. Right now, what we have in the world, we have a problem of refugees coming from these countries that had been colonized and to a large extent still are colonized. The countries cannot develop because they don't own most of the resources that are there. The resources are owned by Britain. So what is happening is that in the UK, for example, the major thing with the statues is the legacy of Great Britain. What we don't understand is, as long as we are keeping up or wanting to maintain the legacy of the Great Britain, we are continuing the problem with refugees, and we are creating the very problems we don't want at our doorsteps. Because the countries that have been colonized, that are suffering, cannot develop, cannot move forward. So what is going to happen? The people will keep on running to the countries that are seen to be developed and well-standing. So if we do not address the issues that came with colonialism and the disparities and daylight robbery that has happened with it, because for others, it is the museums. You go to museums and see artifacts from your own country. That is not the problem. The problem is the museum are a representation of what is actually happening, that the livelihood of people have been stolen, the livelihood are there, and what we see is mainly a legacy celebrated in statues. So I don't know if the breaking of statues is going to help or anything, but I do understand that if we want to change the problem, I do agree with the issue of repatriation. I do understand the issue of the cancellation of death. They are more concrete examples, but the story, the statues tell a story, and we need to find a way to retell the story. We have always told the story from the side of the victor. One of the things I look at is Exodus, the Exodus story. We have the story of the plagues and the Israelites leaving Egypt. We are reading it from the Jewish perspective. I have always wondered, how would this story read from the Egyptian point of view? How would the Egyptians record this? I haven't found it yet. You guys are educated. If you find it, please send it my way. Because the way that the story is told will always be biased, irrespective of where you tell it from. But what we can do is we can create a new story, a story that does not look at one nation being greater than the others, a story that looks at the human race as living together. See what I have and how I could help you with it. Don't take it from me, but also see what you have and how I can get it from you and not have to depend on you. The legacy that I have a problem with is I visited the Church of Scotland once. I attended one of your assemblies, and you have that thing, I don't know what you call it, where you go out into the park and you have the tents and shows what the different committees and desks are doing. What do you call it?
Heart and soul.
That is it. And I went to it, and it's nice. It's a gathering, and you know what's happening in your church. But as an African, I couldn't help but see that every tent had pictures of Africans in them. Every tent, apart from the ones that deal with nature, of course, had pictures of Africans begging, Africans depending on them. And that kind of hit me to the core, because I look at it and it's like, so this is what I look like to other people. This is all I am. Of course, I know that was not the intention, but the way we tell the story tells a lot. And I have seen in some congregations where they have put, what they are doing, how they are helping, the creation of wells and everything so that villages can have water. That is a nice project. But my question is, why should it be like that? Why do we have to depend on that? And why does it have to be one-sided? And that is because of a history that has been told from one side. But we are in a position to create a new story that tells a side from both sides. I don't know how much of the removal of stories of monuments can actually do, if it does anything. That is just my 5 cents with the rest. Let's start a new story.
So how is God calling us to start a new story built upon the foundation of his good news going forth to all nations, not dominizing them, not making them ours, but declaring the good news of Christ? And so how can we be reconcilers in that way? So while taking a statue down could be an important part of it, how do we claim the true story of the past and continue on with a new story, not filtered, not fiction, but honoring all of our brothers and sisters from every nation? And for today's talk, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us there, but all of us will be back next week for another conversation, so please join us next week. I just want to thank you for giving your time to be with us in Gordon Presbytery today. So thank you so much, Aquila, Boitumelo, Carl, Rhona, Joshua. Thanks, you guys. And thank you all in Gordon Presbytery.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.